Hello and welcome back to An Old Man Watches. Today I'm going to be talking about the last two Godzilla films to be made in the 1970s. Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla and its direct sequel, Terror of Mechagodzilla. Now, Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla starts on Okinawa, where we hear the legend of King Caesar, an ancient monster that protected the island from outside forces. At some time, however, the secret of awakening this great defender was lost and the island came under Japanese rule. The descendants of the former Okinawan rulers aren't the biggest fans of their Japanese overlords, and so when Godzilla appears to revert to his original destructive ways, cutting a swath of devastation across Japan, they're not exactly crying about that fact. But something's not quite right with Big G. His roar sounds slightly off, and his atomic breath has an unusual yellowish tint to it. When Anguirus confronts the rampaging Titan and gets whipped like a mule in the process, we get a hint of the truth. A tear in Godzilla's skin reveals the glint of metal underneath. Later, the real Godzilla turns up to face this imposter, which is revealed to be a massive robot under the control of aliens who are intent on conquering Earth. Godzilla manages to damage the newly named Mechagodzilla enough that the aliens have to return it to base for improvement, but the robot definitely had the better of the battle overall. Once it returns, new and improved, and with even more fearsome capabilities, can even the King of the Monsters hope to stand against it? I mean, obviously yes, since a year later, Terror of Mechagodzilla would see the emergence of a second, even more advanced mechanical menace. That film begins with a submarine exploring the ocean in search of the original Mechagodzilla's remains. Instead, they encounter a gigantic dinosaur. The submarine is destroyed and the crew goes missing, prompting the authorities to begin a search to find them. The search leads them to a disgraced scientist, or at least to his house. His daughter tells them the man they're looking for has been dead for 5 years. She is, however, lying. Her father is alive and conspiring with the aliens from the last film to build a new Mechagodzilla and then unleash it, along with his monster, Titanosaurus, upon Japan. Naturally, Godzilla is the only thing that may be able to thwart this diabolical duo. So, after years of lesser budgets, leading to, in my opinion, lesser films, and probably more important to the producers, lesser ticket sales, Toho decided to celebrate Godzilla's 20th anniversary by injecting a little more cash into the 14th entry in the series. And it made a difference, which is not to say that Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla is entirely free of the flaws that have plagued the previous few films. We're still lumbered with the rounder, friendlier Godzilla suit of the kid oriented entries in the series, for one thing, but it does show a bit more ambition overall, and in my opinion, it's a pretty fun romp. Terror of Mechagodzilla, meanwhile, would be the first truly direct sequel that the franchise had tried. It would also be the least successful Godzilla film of all time, financially speaking. A fate that ultimately led to Toho putting the franchise on hiatus, a hiatus that turned out to last almost a decade. That wasn't a deliberate choice. They announced but abandoned several Godzilla projects in the late 70s. But I think the big gap was probably for the best. The franchise's formula was looking as threadbare as some of the battered old kaiju sets by this stage. But what of these two films in particular? What features do they share other than a common antagonist? Well, as you might imagine, I found a few things to talk about. The first thing I think I should note is that of the three new kaiju presented in these films, two of them are visually pretty goofy. King Caesar is, in my opinion, definitely the worst offender in this regard. Although the suit is quite detailed, the kaiju design suffers from a couple of serious problems. The first is that the costume is so much less bulky than that of the other kaiju. This makes it much smaller and it looks much frailer than the other combatants. And it also makes it more obvious that this is a person in a suit. The advantage of greater movement and mobility is obviously a positive factor, but I don't think those positive factors match up to the negative factors. And the second problem is that, well, King Caesar looks a lot like someone cosplaying their Cocker Spaniel persona. And while I have no wish to harsh on anyone's consensual buzz, a floppy-eared poppy dog is not a look that screams fierce defender to me. Meanwhile, we've got Titanosaurus, who also looks goofy, mostly an issue with the snout, which looks skinny and anemic. But at least Fish Dinosaur Hybrid is more thematically successful as a monster concept, and the costume's fin tail actually looks quite cool. I do have to say that Mechagodzilla itself bucks the goofy trend. It looks pretty darn good and menacing. I would not be surprised if the fact that it doesn't have to look believably organic helped in that regard. On the plus side for fans of kaiju action, and in what seems to have become a recurring theme for the franchise's films in the 70s, both of these movies feature really good bad guy rampages. Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla smartly offers up this sequence quite early in the runtime, with the robot, still disguised as the real Godzilla at this time, savagely beating Anguirus and then storming through an oil refinery. There are lots of satisfying explosions and destruction in this scene, even before the real Big G turns up for the movie's first major kaiju throwdown. Terror of Godzilla, meanwhile, takes a lot longer to get to its best section, which is when Titanosaurus and Mechagodzilla go on a two kaiju Tokyo rampage. It does offer an earlier solo Titanosaurus city stomp, though, so at least we're not waiting a full hour for some kind of significant kaiju action. Both of these sequences of destruction are fun, and I mean, if people in rubber suits smashing model sets is part of what you look for in kaiju films, and why wouldn't it be? They've got you well covered. Unfortunately, the flip side to these fun rampages is that they both rather overshadow the final battles of their respective films. These final confrontations both go on for too long for the actual amount of fun action that they offer up, with Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla perhaps being the worst culprit on that front. A big drawback also with the concluding fight of that movie is that after spending a significant chunk of the runtime on the quest to revive King Caesar, the new kaiju achieves almost nothing in the fight. Instead, Godzilla wins the day by unveiling hitherto unrevealed electromagnetic powers, which, as you might imagine, prove very effective against a robot. As an aside, I must admit the scene where Godzilla uses a lightning storm to store up the necessary power for this new power set earlier in the movie is a quite cool sequence. The final confrontation of Terror of Mechagodzilla, meanwhile, is simply too slapstick and static. Godzilla and his robot opponent seem to do more posturing at one another than actual fighting, while Titanosaurus is largely incapacitated by Godzilla's human allies. So in the final analysis, while both of these films are better than the two that immediately preceded them, it was clear that the Godzilla franchise had more or less run out of steam by this point. It's probably no bad thing that Godzilla would take a long break after these releases, not returning to screens until 1984. Next time, the opulent British historical drama Cromwell from 1970. Publicity for the film loudly proclaimed the depth of research that had gone into it. As usual, when movies make such boasts, those claims should be taken with a very, very large pinch of salt. But that's next time. Until then, thanks for watching this video, and I hope you enjoyed it. And if you've seen either of these Mechagodzilla films, let me know what you thought of them.